Okay, calm down. You're getting nervous, man. You're getting nervous, man. Okay, calm down.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Katie Halper Show. We have such a great episode for you today. We are interviewing the inimitable John Mearsheimer. Before we bring on Professor Mearsheimer, though, I just want to remind people to please give the stream a like, give it a thumbs up. Just do it once, because if you do it twice, it cancels out. Also, subscribe if you haven't already. And to do that, you just hit the subscribe button and then the bell. And if you can be Patreon supporters, because we literally couldn't do this show without you on Patreon, you can do that at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Again, that's patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. And you get extended interviews, bonus content. For this week, you actually get some artwork by Brad. He uploaded a really cool video that he did. And down the pike, we'll have extended interviews with David Cross. You already have an extended interview with Michael Tracy, Brace Belden. So more to come. And I think that's it. I'm just going to start the show. So excited to be bringing on Professor Mearsheimer, a political scientist and author, who is the co-author of the seminal book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. He's the author of several other books, including The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams, and International Realities, and Why Leaders Lie, The Truth About Lying in International Politics. So, and he's also Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor in the Political Science Department at the University of Chicago. So welcome, Professor Mearsheimer.
Thank you, Katie. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. We're so glad you're here. You are very prolific in your writing and in your interview appearances. So I actually wanted to ask you some questions about your, not your personal life in an inappropriate way, but how you got to become the person who you are today. What kind of politics were you raised in? Were your parents political, and have you always had this political realist perspective that you are so well known for?
Well, my parents were not political at all. I was born in New York City and grew up in New York City and then the suburbs of New York. And my parents were not political. My father was basically a Republican, and my mother came from a very Democratic family. They're both basically New York ethnics. And they hardly ever talked about politics. It wasn't until I went to West Point and towards the end of my time there where I got interested in international politics, not domestic politics, international politics, that I became fascinated with the subject. Of course, it was hard to avoid politics when I was in my late teens and when I was at West Point, in large part because of the Vietnam War. And I remember very well, the events of 1968. So I began to get a taste for politics in a serious way then, but not any real intellectual interest until I started studying international relations. And then I got into a PhD program at Cornell and eventually became a professor at the University of Chicago. And I think what happened over time, in large part because I am intellectually very curious, is that I started asking all sorts of questions about politics in general, going beyond international politics. And at some point, I came to the realization that everything is connected. And if you want to know a lot about how the international system works, you have to know a lot about domestic politics and vice versa. So with the passage of time, I learned a great deal about politics in general. And at the same time, I started off basically as a straightforward academic, and the idea of commenting on the real world and acting as something of, let's call it, a public intellectual really didn't cross my mind. But I always felt that my academic work had relevance for what was going on in the real world. So what happened is that over time, I got increasingly involved in the public debates that were taking place inside the country, and really inside places like Europe and Asia as well. And with the passage of time, I've gotten more and more involved. And as you well know, that's certainly true with the outbreak of the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. But in a nutshell, that's sort of how it all happened.
Interesting. And have you had kind of political ideology influence you at all? Because I know that you are, again, a student, well, a professor of the School of Political Realism. I'm just kind of fascinated and curious about how that can intersect with political ideology.
It's funny, when I first went to graduate school, this is in 1975, there were sort of three dominant paradigms for looking at the world in the field of international relations. One was liberalism, two was realism, and three was Marxism. It's hard to believe now, but Marxism was a very important paradigm for thinking about international politics. Whether you accepted that paradigm or not, you knew a lot about it. And I actually read a lot of Marx back in the day. I took a course on Marxist theories of the state. And of course, this has all gone away now. But those were the sort of big paradigms of the day. But when I went to graduate school, and even when I was a postdoc at Harvard for the first 2 years after I got my PhD, I did not really view myself as a realist.
Mm.
I didn't think about realism versus liberalism versus Marxism. I knew the literatures, but I didn't pay much attention to sort of categorizing myself. But after I got to the University of Chicago and I started teaching a basic IR theory course, I came to the realization that I was effectively a realist. Now, why did I decide that I was a realist? A lot of people say, oh, it's because you went to West Point, and therefore, how could you be anything but a realist? I really don't think that's true. And I could point to a number of people who went to West Point who got PhDs who fit in the liberal category, not the realist category. I think that I became a realist because I concluded, and one doesn't have to agree with this, but I concluded that it was the best of those three paradigms for explaining how the world works. I think realism is far from a perfect set of theories, but it is the best among those three sets of theories. And for that reason, I sort of settled on self-identifying as a realist.
Hmm. Well, we're going to get more into that because I want to kind of show people what that looks like. And we're actually going to play a clip from Piers Morgan, where Piers Morgan is talking to you. And this clip, he's talking about Afghanistan. And I think your response sheds a lot of light on what it means to be a political realist. Although I am curious if there's not actual overlap, potential overlap between the Marxist school and the realist school in some ways more than there would be between uh, the liberal school and the other two. But we can talk about that after this clip.
Okay.
Okay. So here's Piers Morgan.
You want to remember that if you look at what's happening in the conventional war, it looks like Putin's going to win, despite the fact that we've now passed
This starts at
large-scale
104, Brad. Sorry.
In saying that, given what's happened since, I thought throwing the country back to the Taliban was a catastrophic error of judgment, and it wouldn't have happened in the way it's happened if America kept a couple of thousand troops there, as it does all around the world in endless bases. So it seemed to me, having done many, many years of hard work in Afghanistan as a response to 9/11, to then simply just overnight throw everybody out and leave the country to the Taliban, particularly for women's rights, never mind anything else, I thought was an abrogation of America's duty, and the UK.
Right, but this is your worldview, which is the United States has a responsibility to be everywhere and
Not
to never
everywhere,
quit until
but
it
they should
wins.
certainly be preserving freedom and democracy. Otherwise, why self-style yourself as leader of the free world? You either are leader of the free world, and America still has, I think, half the world's military firepower, and obviously one of the biggest economies. You either are that entity, leader of the free world, or you're not. And if you are, then what comes with that is a responsibility to protect freedom and democracy when it comes under attack from totalitarian regimes, I would think.
I think if you look at the history of American foreign policy, it's very hard to make the case that our principal goal has been to protect freedom and democracy. The United States has a rich history of overthrowing democracies around the world, and we have a rich history of siding with some of the world's biggest dictators. So this idea that we're out there protecting freedom and democracy and it's our principal goal, in my opinion, doesn't mesh with reality.
So, what is the thing that is motivating the United States and other Western powers? I mean, for people who aren't familiar with your work and with political realism.
Well, I think there's no question that during the unipolar moment, and this runs from roughly 1991 when the Soviet Union collapses and until about 2017 when we morph into a multipolar world. But during the unipolar moment, where the United States was incredibly powerful, we pursued a liberal policy. This is the policy that Piers was describing. Piers has the mentality that most people have in the West about what the United States should do in the world. He thinks that we have a responsibility and we have a right to run around the world and interfere in the domestic politics of every country on the planet. He believes that we should reshape the politics of countries that we don't think meet the criteria that we've established for a successful liberal democracy. My view has long been, and this is the view of almost all realists, is that this is a prescription for disaster, that the United States should not be interfering in the politics of other countries unless it's absolutely necessary. And in fact, when you do that, it's going to backfire. Witness what happened to the Soviets when they were in Afghanistan. Witness what happened to us when we were in Afghanistan. Witness what happened to us in Vietnam and then later in Iraq. You want to stay out of these places. A realist like me says that what really matters are the other great powers in the system. And what you want to concern yourself with is the balance of power between the great powers or among the great powers. And you want your country to be as powerful as possible relative to all the other countries, because that's the best way to survive. So what you have, if you look at the historical record, is a situation where virtually all the realists opposed the Vietnam War, except for Henry Kissinger, who's not really much of a, or was not much of a realist. And almost all the realists, except for Henry Kissinger, opposed the Iraq War in 2003 as well. Steve Walt and I, two card-carrying realists, led the charge against the Iraq War in 2003. So again, this whole idea that we have a right and a responsibility to interfere in the politics of other countries around the world is just not a smart way to do business.
So, what explains, returning to Kissinger, how is he a realist who's also obviously a major interventionist? How does one reconcile that?
Well, Henry Kissinger, more than anything else, was an opportunist.
Okay.
And a lot depended on which way the wind was blowing. And he was I think that instinctively he was a realist, but given that he wanted to have lots of influence, not only in Washington, but other places around the world, he had a tendency to tell people what he thought they wanted to hear. So he kind of blew at the wind. And
Yeah.
That's why he was in favor of the Vietnam War. He was a real hawk on Vietnam. You want to remember that people like Hans Morgenthau, Walter Lippmann, George Kennan, Ken Waltz, all these, big name realists were adamant opponents of the Vietnam War. And again, if we went to the 2003 Iraq War, you'd see the same basic pattern. But again, very interestingly, Kissinger, who was so often identified as a realist, was the one exception in both wars.
Right. Can you be a neocon and a realist at the same time, or are those conflicts of interest?
No, neocons are basically liberals. I
Okay.
mean, the argument that Piers was making is basically a neocon line of argument. There's not a lot of difference between neoconservatives and liberal interventionists.
Right.
I think one could argue that the neoconservatives have a slightly greater affinity for going to war than the liberal internationalists do. And I think the liberal internationalists tend to have a greater affinity for international institutions
Right.
than the neocons do. The neocons really don't like institutions because they think that institutions are where the Lilliputians tied down Gulliver.
Right.
But by and large, there's just not a lot of difference between someone like Madeleine Albright, who is a real liberal, and Paul Wolfowitz, who was a neoconservative. They're basically birds of a feather, but neither one of them are realist.
Right. So, where does a country like Cuba fit into this? Because maybe it's naive of me, and certainly one can disagree with or disapprove of Cuba, but it does seem like, in terms of being politically realist and a rational actor, they do have some kind of ethical or moral vision that's not just about political survival. Or am I just being naive?
You mean Cuba does?
Cuba, yeah.
Well, almost all countries have some ideology. Some have a very powerful ideology. There's no question that for many years, Cuba was a communist country, especially in Fidel's early days. The Soviet Union at one point was a heavily communist-oriented country. Nazi Germany was a fascist country. The United States is a liberal democracy. With regard to Cuba, let me say a few words. First of all, Cuba matters a lot to the United States from a realist point of view because it's physically located in the Western Hemisphere. And it's America's backyard. And the United States is going to care more about the Western Hemisphere than any other region of the world, simply because it's our backyard. And Cuba is right next door to us. And that means we're going to pay a lot of attention to Cuba. But our attitude towards Cuba during the Cold War, when the real trouble started, was not simply based on geopolitics. It was also based on the fact that Cuba was a communist country. And as you well know, during the Cold War, and this was true even before and after the Cold War, any country in Latin America that has leftist leanings is likely to end up in America's gun sights, and we're likely to try to topple that regime. It doesn't even have to be a communist regime. All it has to do is be left-leaning, and we'll do terrible things.
Dominican Republic or Guatemala.
Yeah, Guatemala is a very good example. 1954, Nicaragua. We could go on and on. Chile, 1973. Right. These are just all examples. And if we go back earlier in the century, you'll see evidence of that sort of anti-left wing tendencies in American foreign policy when it comes to dealing with Latin America. From a realist point of view, I think this doesn't make much sense, right? Because in a realist story, ideology doesn't matter that much. In my view, you can live with a communist country. We could have lived with Cuba. The problem with Cuba was that once it became an enemy of the United States, Cuba went to the Soviet Union for help. And once Cuba went to the Soviet Union for help, then it became an important geopolitical issue. And of course, the first manifestation of this was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then later, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, I remember very well, the Soviets were talking about building a naval base at Cienfuegos in Cuba. And the Americans told them in no uncertain terms that that is not happening. And that's geopolitical logic at play. But again, I don't want to argue that there was no ideological dimension to this, because there was a powerful ideological dimension. And actually, I think if you look at our relationship with Cuba today, it's really quite remarkable that we can't get over the fact that we had this crisis with Cuba during the Cold War. I mean, Cuba is not a communist country in any meaningful sense. It's not a threat to the United States in an ideological way. A lot of people argued during the Cold War that ideology really mattered and communism anywhere was a real problem. I didn't believe that, but I could see where people made that argument. But how can you make that argument today? But we cannot get over the fact that Cuba crossed us during the Cold War. The fact that Fidel formed a close relationship with the Soviets, which led to them placing missiles in Cuba, is something that we've never gotten over. And go ahead.
No, you finish what you're saying. Sorry.
I was just going to say, to my amazement, we still have gun sights on Cuba, even when we have a Democratic president like Joe Biden.
There is also, I mean, you obviously wrote this amazing book on the Israel lobby, but there is a Cuba lobby, is there not?
Absolutely. And Florida, is not so much as a Freudian slip. Well, given what I'm now going to say, you'll see why I made that mistake. Florida used to be a real swing state. Remember the 2000 election? And in a swing state where there are a significant number of Cuban Americans, you want to make sure that you don't alienate those Cuban Americans. And those Cuban Americans, by and large, in Florida, are profoundly anti-Castro / anti-Cuba. So it is, or it has been, very difficult for us to have good relations with Cuba because of the Cuba lobby.
Right.
So there's no question that you're on the money when you raise the issue of the Cuba lobby.
There's also an interesting parallel I've found between the Israel lobby and the Cuba lobby, in that you have, for obvious reasons, older people who are much more maybe emotionally driven about the issue and extreme and very, very vocal. And then you have, especially the younger generation, which really doesn't have that kind of attachment to it. And you're seeing a real demographic shift.
Yeah, I had a student, he was an undergrad here at Chicago, probably about 10 years ago, who wrote a BA thesis under my supervision on the Cuba lobby. And he made exactly that point, and he had a lot of data to support it. But as I recollect, his argument was that the elders tend to select the more hawkish individuals among the youth to replace them. So there is this continuity in terms of a hawkish attitude towards Cuba.
So shifting gears a little bit, want to talk about, of course, something that you've talked about a lot. You've also written about Israel and Palestine, and wanted to start off by showing you a clip of Secretary of State Antony Blinken being asked by Andrea Mitchell about the ceasefire deal.
You say that everyone but Hamas has agreed to this. Benjamin Netanyahu has certainly said otherwise publicly, and the hostage families are saying you should try everything if this fails. And it's quite possible it will fail, with him now toughening his position, more likely, with his right-wing partners. If this fails, they want you to work through Qatar and deal with Hamas to get the Americans home. And we are reporting at NBC News that that is being discussed as a backup plan, if no other way to get a ceasefire, doing it without Israel agreeing to a ceasefire. Can you tell us about that? And also, if the war continues, won't the Palestinian death toll be unacceptable? As the National Security Advisor in Israel has said, till the end of the year, after such a horrific death toll in getting the hostages out militarily this weekend.
First, let me be very clear. Israel has accepted the proposal. In fact, they were critical in putting it forward. So the only party, no, that is what the official position of the Israeli government and the Prime Minister. So the only party that has not accepted, the only party that's not said yes, is Hamas. That's who everyone's waiting on. That's who the Palestinians in Gaza are waiting on. It's who the Israelis are waiting on. It's who the hostages and the hostage families are waiting on. It's who the entire region and the entire world is waiting on. And so we'll see. Does Hamas want to end this conflict, end this war that it started, or not? We'll find out. But it's clear that virtually the entire world has come together in support of the proposal. And the only open question is, will Hamas say yes?
A lot to unpack there, but can you shed some light and insight into the deal, which Israel is claiming it's not accepting, and the U.S. is claiming Israel is accepting?
Yeah, I mean, trying to figure out what is going on here is almost impossible. Just before I describe the deal, he says that Israel has accepted the deal. And as you know, the administration has a tendency to talk about the deal as if it was Israel's deal. In other words, they proposed it, Israel. We accepted it. We put it before the UN Security Council. And now we have a UN Security Council resolution backing Israel's deal. So what we have to do now is just get Hamas to agree. That's the story that Biden and the administration tend to tell. But if you look at what's happened, what both sides, and here we're talking about Hamas and Israel, were required to do was respond with a formal report or formal letter to the UN Security Council resolution/plan. Hamas has responded with a formal letter. Israel has not responded. Now, the Israeli press today is reporting that even though Hamas responded, if you look carefully at their response, this is according to the Israelis, Hamas really doesn't accept the deal. They want to change X, Y, and Z. Okay, but they've at least responded with a formal letter. Israel has not responded. And when you listen to what the Israelis are saying about the deal, they're all over the map. It all depends who you're talking to and what day you're talking to that person. So I don't know how Blinken can say that the only remaining party to declare its agreement to the deal is Hamas, because Hamas, I'm not saying they've agreed because I haven't seen their letter, but they at least submitted a formal letter. The Israelis haven't even done that. And there's no evidence that the Israelis agree to this deal the way Blinken describes it. So it's hard to know for sure what's going on here, but it does not sound like Blinken is telling a true story.
Right. And it's worth noting also, this is Andrea Mitchell questioning him. She's not someone who's extremely critical of the Biden administration or of Israel. So
Yeah.
they're kind of losing their usual allies.
Yeah, let me give you my take, if you don't mind,
Yeah,
on
of course.
why I think it's hard to see how you get a ceasefire. I mean, I do hope you get a ceasefire, and I hope it becomes permanent for sure. But the problem is that what Hamas wants, for understandable reasons, is they want a permanent ceasefire. But Israel doesn't want a permanent ceasefire. They want a temporary ceasefire, and then they want to go back on the offensive because the Israeli view is they have to finish the job. Remember, Netanyahu is firmly committed to decisively defeating Hamas. And if you get a temporary or ceasefire now, he's not going to have decisively defeated Hamas. So he wants to be able to go back on the offensive. And of course, Hamas wants to end this once and for all. So that's one major point of disagreement. The second thing is Hamas wants Israel to withdraw all its forces from Gaza. They want every IDF soldier out, period. And you can understand why Hamas wants that. But the Israelis, of course, don't want to do that because they haven't finished off Hamas, and they understand full well there are going to be problems inside of Gaza in the foreseeable future. So they want to remain. I think they're probably, as best I can tell from news reports, willing, this is the Israelis, willing to pull out of the populous areas, willing to pull out of the cities and the large towns, but they want to remain in Gaza. And of course, unsurprisingly, Hamas doesn't want them to remain in Gaza. Now, the question I would ask you is, how do you square those circles? I just don't see how you do it. The Americans probably think they can finesse it, but when you're dealing with Hamas and you're dealing with the Israelis, it's very hard to finesse anything because these are, two ruthless actors who are at each other's throats, and they're looking for opportunities to inflict massive pain on each other. So how you square those two circles, I don't know.
You referred to October 7th as a prison break and not, quote, not terribly surprising. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, what was going on in Gaza is that up until 2005, well, let me go back a little bit further. The Israelis gained control of Gaza in 1967. As a result of the famous 67 war, Israel got control of the West Bank and Gaza. And from 1967 until 2005, the Israelis occupied Gaza. They had settlers in Gaza, and they had a large contingent of military forces in Gaza. But the place was a hornet's nest. And they were more concerned, the Israelis were more concerned about the West Bank, about the occupation of the West Bank, which they wanted to not only maintain, but expand. So what Ariel Sharon did in 2005 is he pulled out of Gaza. He pulled all the settlers and the military out of Gaza. Now, Israel's defenders today like to argue that what the Israelis were doing was presenting the Palestinians in Gaza with a wonderful opportunity to turn it into Dubai and on the Mediterranean and live happily ever after. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Israelis continued to control Gaza's borders. They continued to control the air above Gaza, and they continued to control its water supply, and so forth and so on. And then in 2007, remember, the Israelis pull out in 2005. In 2007, Hamas takes control in Gaza, and the Israelis really turned the screws on Hamas. And over the course of the time from roughly 2005 up until now, people have come to argue that Gaza is an open-air prison, that the Palestinians who live in Gaza are basically prisoners. It's an absolutely horrible life, and the Israelis go to great lengths to make it that way. So this is why when the Palestinians, and here we're talking about Hamas and a handful of other resistance groups in Gaza, broke out on October 7th, it was referred to as a prison break.
Yeah, and just going back to that point you made about the disengagement or pulling out of Gaza, which people like to point to as a sign of generosity on Israel's part, and an example of why Palestinians can't rule themselves. I wanted to just show this article from The Guardian. And here we have Ariel Sharon's chief aide making some honest statements about what was really behind this. He said, when you freeze that process, you prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state, and you prevent a discussion on the refugees, the borders, and Jerusalem. Effectively, this whole package called the Palestinian state, with all that it entails, has been removed indefinitely from our agenda. And all this with authority and permission, all with the presidential blessing and the ratification of both houses of Congress. And he calls the disengagement, he says the disengagement is actually formaldehyde. It supplies the amount of formaldehyde that is necessary so that there will not be a political process with the Palestinians. So
I remember it very well. It was Dove Weinglass, and
yeah.
he said that they were basically putting the Palestinians in formaldehyde.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is a lot like the claims that Israel has wanted to give the Palestinians a state of their
Right.
own. And they've offered the Palestinians a viable state on numerous occasions, and the Palestinians have turned it down and turned to terror at every turn. This is, this is a story that can't be supported by the evidence, period. And the same thing is true with regard to Gaza.
Right.
The Israelis had no interest in turning Gaza into Dubai on the Mediterranean. In fact, what they wanted to do was, put the Palestinians in Gaza in a giant prison and inflict massive pain on them.
Right. You've called Israel an apartheid state, which I obviously have done too, and I got fired for saying that. But you've called Israel an apartheid state, and you've said that they're engaging in genocide. And you actually called Netanyahu, you said about Netanyahu that he basically represents Jim Crow. So can you expand on that?
Well, those are three different issues. Let's just take them in turn.
Sure.
With regard to whether or not Israel is an apartheid state, anybody who has any doubt about that should read the Human Rights Watch report, the Amnesty International report, and the B'Tselem report on this very issue. These are extensive reports, thoroughly documented, done by, extremely competent and honest and smart individuals. And I don't see how anybody could come away from reading those reports without thinking that Israel is an apartheid state. I would
Well, they'll
also,
say that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are anti-Semitic. That's what some people say. It gets harder though when you throw in B'Tselem, which I guess would be self-loathing according to the logic of people who call those organizations anti-Semitic.
well, as you know, the term anti-Semitic is thrown around so
Of course,
loosely
yeah,
that
right,
anybody who criticizes Israel is an anti-Semite. I
right,
know that you and I are both well-known anti-Semites.
right. Yes,
It's just, it's kind of crazy where
it
we
is.
are.
Yeah,
You could
I'm just saying. No,
go ahead.
keep on. Well, the nice thing about B'Tselem is it makes it a little bit harder to write off that claim as anti-Semitic.
Look, I could give you a list of probably about 8 Israeli senior figures who have said Israel is an apartheid state.
Right.
This is an argument that
Yeah.
you hear in Israel quite often. Bishop Tutu, right, who, of course, lived in apartheid South Africa, came to Israel and said it was an apartheid state. He and others like Ronnie Kasrils, who was a very prominent South African Jew, who was a major force during the apartheid era in South Africa. He and Bishop Tutu both said that what you saw in Israel, what they saw in Israel, was worse than apartheid in South Africa.
Yeah.
So there's just a whole slew of people outside of those 3 reports
Right.
who back up what those 3 reports conclude. Now, before I go to the whole subject of genocide, let's just talk about the Jim Crow charge. What I was talking about there was the claim that many Israelis and Israel's supporters, many of Israel's supporters make, that we share values. Okay, that in other words, the United States of America and Israel have the same values. And the point I was making is the only values that we share with the Israelis are old values that are thankfully now gone, which dominated mainly in the South after the American Civil War and up to the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. And that's when Jim Crow America was alive and well in the South, and even to some extent in the North, to be honest. But anyway, Israel today is basically the equivalent of the Jim Crow South. That's certainly true in the West Bank and in Gaza. We could argue what it looks like inside Green Line Israel, where it's not quite as bad as in those 2 other places. But anyway, that's the context in which I brought up the Jim Crow analogy. And again, I was talking about apartheid.
Right. I think it's spot on, by the way. We had Chaz Friedman, Aaron Mate and I interviewed Chaz Friedman, and he's compared Israel's ideology to the KKK's ideology. So
it's amazing what's happened to Israel. I find it very hard to believe. I mean, I was someone who, I came of age in the 1950s, and my whole view of Israel was deeply informed by Leon Uris's famous book, Exodus. I had a very romantic view of Israel, and I thought that the Israelis were clearly the good guys and that the Palestinians, or the Arabs, as people called them at the time, were the bad guys. And it's amazing the extent to which people like me and many other people I've known have fundamentally changed their view of Israel. And there are a number of factors that explain that. But what Israel has become, and you see this manifested in the war in Gaza, it's just really hard to believe. But anyway, that's where we are. Let me say a few words about genocide.
yeah, please.
I think that if you look at the South African report that was submitted to the ICJ, and I think 84 pages long, thoroughly documented, a really well done report on what the Israelis were doing in Gaza as of late December 2023. You want to remember that they sent their report to the ICJ in late 2023. And then it was in January 2024 that the ICJ, based on that report and all sorts of other pieces of information, the ICJ said there was sufficient evidence to make the case that there was a plausible case, to make a plausible case that Israel was committing genocide. And if you look at what Israel has done since January 2024, it has in no way taken its foot off the accelerator. It's continued to pound Gaza. And it's not surprising that South Africa has intervened again with the ICJ because they were so disturbed by what's been happening since the ruling. But anyway, I paid careful attention to the report, the South African report. I listened to all the testimony, and I've been studying the issue myself. And I think when you look at what is necessary to prove genocide, and you look at what the Israelis are doing, I think it's hard not to conclude they're engaged in genocide. And I think that eventually the ICJ, when they resolve it once and for all, will reach the conclusion that this is genocide.
It's interesting what you said. I've heard a lot of people say this, that, they used to support Israel and now they don't. But how much of what Israel's doing now is a departure from the way they used to be versus how much is it that we just see it on social media? I mean, because Israel was founded, right, through, even Benny Morris admits, he doesn't use the word, but ethnic cleansing or transfer, as he admits, as he calls it. So I guess my question is, how much has Israel changed versus how much we've just seen it for what it is?
I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you in good part, but not completely. There's no question that from the beginning, the Zionists who came to Palestine understood that there was going to have to be massive ethnic cleansing for purposes of creating a Jewish state. There's no way that Zionists coming out of Europe and landing in Palestine, where there is a large population of Palestinians, can create a Jewish state without doing significant ethnic cleansing. And of course, they cleansed or transferred. Transfer was the word back then. They transferred about 750,000 Palestinians in 1948, many of whom, by the way, went to Gaza. And many of these people fighting today are descendants of those people who were pushed out in 1948. And then the second big cleansing was mainly in the West Bank after the 1967 war. There's no question that what the Israelis did, especially in 48, was absolutely horrific. And there's also no question that we didn't know much about it in the West. And furthermore, the Israelis were able to purvey this story that the Arab armies, which went to war against Israel shortly after it declared its independence, this is, I believe, May 14th, 1948. The Israelis declare their independence, and Israel then ends up in a war with a number of Arab armies. And the story that we were told when I was young was that the reason the Palestinians left was not because they were cleansed, but because these Arab armies told them to leave. They were going to come in, they would kill all the Israelis or all the Zionists or all the Jews. And once they were done killing them, throwing them into the sea, the Palestinians could come back to their house or to their houses.
Right.
This story is completely false. There's no evidence to support it. The Israelis cleansed Gaza. And what's happened is we have figured all of this out with the passage of time. Just very quickly, if I can tell you sort of what I think is the series of events that changed not only my thinking, but all sorts of people's thinking about Israel and undermined this Exodus story that was so firmly entrenched in people's minds a long time ago. The first big event is the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. That was heavily covered in the media. And here you see the importance of the media. This gets back to the very important point you were making, especially about social media today. But the media began to cover things in a big way in 1982 in ways that it didn't in 1948. And we saw what was happening. And it was a terrible picture. And of course, the massacres in Sabra and Shatila did enormous damage to Israel's reputation. Then in the late 1980s, the new historians came along. You mentioned Benny Morris's name, but Ilan Pappé was another prominent figure. Avi Schleim was another prominent figure. And there were a number of other people as well. And they got access to the Israeli archives. And they told the story about what really happened in 1948. They told you how Israel was created. And they not only told you what happened in 1948, they took you back to the early 20th century and told you how people like Ben-Gurion thought about what was necessary to create a Jewish state in a sea of Arabs. And what's very important to understand here is that once you heard the explanation that people like Morris and people like Schleim and Pape were providing, you understood that it made perfect sense, right? You understood that the Israelis or the Zionists had to do terrible things to create a Jewish state. It was just unavoidable. So from a logical point of view and from an empirical point of view, or from the historical record, you began to see what was really going on in terms of how Israel was created. Now, third thing you want to keep in mind is you had the first Intifada in 1987. This is the first big public uprising. Again, this is when you have a lot of news coverage. And then in the 90s, the situation began to move back in the other direction because of the Oslo peace process. But that all failed. And then you had the second Intifada. And after the second Intifada and more historical work being done on Israel, especially by Arab and Palestinian scholars. This is another very important part of the change that took place since I was a young man, if not young boy. In those days, it was basically white people who, Europeans and Americans who created the discourse about Israel. And most of those people were super friendly to Israel. They were pro-Israel. That world has gone away. You now have lots of people like Rashid Halidi, right, who can tell a very different story. And I want to be very clear here. It's not just Rashid Halidi. It's also the fact that you have lots of Israelis, lots of American Jews, lots of American non-Jews who are telling the same story that Rashid Halidi is telling. Right? There are different twists on all these stories that these people tell, but the same basic story is being told. And now, today, we have alternative media. And you and I talking here is a perfect example of this. You couldn't do this in 1982. You couldn't even do it in 2000 at the time of Camp David, right? When Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat were at Camp David in late 2000 trying to negotiate a settlement. You had no alternative media. You had to depend on the New York Times and CBS and NBC. And of course, what you got was very slanted. You didn't get a critical eye looking at what was going on. Now you have, people like people like Aaron, people like Max Blumenthal, just all sorts of people, Chaz Freeman, me, Steve Walton, so forth and so on. We're all out there, opining on these events. And the discourse has just changed drastically. And it's very hard for Israel's defenders to deceive us. And we're making it very hard for them to deceive, middle America or middle Germany or middle France, right? So the whole discourse has just changed in fundamental ways, and it is not advantageous to Israel.
Right. Although what's frustrating is that we've seen public opinion shift, but public policy has not caught up with it.
No question.
Right.
No question. I mean, the lobby, the lobby operates at two levels. When Steve and I wrote our book, this is one of the first things that we figured out. The lobby is deeply interested in controlling the discourse as much as it can, because controlling the discourse is related to public opinion, what the people in the body politic think. And that's where they've lost out in recent years. That's what we were just talking about. But they care more about the elite level. And there they continue to be wildly successful. It's really quite remarkable. And we'll see this on display on June 24th when Benjamin Netanyahu comes to talk to Congress. I think the only interesting question is how many standing ovations will he get? And what you see is that the lobby continues to maintain tremendous influence on the legislative branch and on the executive branch, and that hasn't changed. And the interesting question moving forward, as I'm sure you recognize, is whether or not all of this change down below will have an impact up on top.
Right. And here's the book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, which Professor Mearsheimer co-wrote with Stephen Walt. What has changed since you wrote that book, besides the public opinion? I mean, is it much easier for people to criticize Israel than it was then?
Yes, and I think you can now, first of all, talk about the lobby itself in ways you couldn't back then. You can talk about the U.S.-Israeli relationship in ways you couldn't back then. And you can talk about whether or not the lobby is doing good things for Israel and for the United States or not in ways that you couldn't back then. So I think that Steve and I did have a lot of influence on the discourse. And a good number of people in the lobby have told me that over the years. But their view is that we may have had influence on the discourse, but we're not having any influence on policy. And as I said a few minutes ago, that's true. But I think the two things that have changed that really matter the most for the lobby and are not good for the lobby is that, first of all, it has to work harder than ever to defend Israel. And it's really working overtime these days. And that means it's out in the open. And lobbies don't want to operate out in the open. You want to operate in very subtle and sophisticated ways. Whether you're the National Rifle Association, the Cuba lobby, the China lobby back in the day, or the Israel lobby. But they are out in the open. Everybody can see evidence of the lobby at work. And this is not good at all. The second thing is they're not able to operate in a subtle way anymore. They're basically now engaged in what I call smash mouth politics. And if you're a lobby, I don't care whether you're the NRA again or the Cuba lobby or the Israel lobby, smash mouth politics is not the way you want to go because you're going to end up alienating lots of people. So what you have, the bottom line here is that what you have is you have a lobby that is much more exposed today than it was in 2006 when Steve and I wrote the article, in 2007 when we wrote the book. Much more exposed and is engaged in smash mouth politics in ways it certainly was not back then. So this is a real problem for the lobby. And then you can marry that to our earlier discussion of the changes that are taking place down below in the population, certainly among younger people, including many American Jews.
Right.
As you know, I like to make this point that it is a fundamental mistake to make the argument that, all Jews are in the lobby or all Jews support Israel. Nothing could be further from the truth, as was evidenced by the fact that in almost all of those college and university protests in recent months, large numbers of Jews were involved and were arrested.
Right. And is Biden's decision to not curtail Israel, is it rational or is it ideological? In other words, he always talks about what a Zionist he is. But could he have said to Israel, you're not going to do this without losing the election. Okay, thank you so much. Have a great night.
You too. Goodbye, Katie.
Bye. What a wonderful interview. Wow, he was so generous. We got so much time with him. I'm very, very happy. And want to thank everyone for tuning in. We have two quick updates we wanted to share. One is that friend of show, she's actually been on the show before. Claire Daly, the member of European Parliament, MEP, member of European Parliament from Ireland, she lost her seat. But to honor her, we wanted to play a few clips of her speaking in Parliament because she's so great. And of course, many times people who are on the right side of history, they lose their seats, but I know that whatever she does next, she'll do a great job. So let's take a look at some of these clips of Claire Daly.
So far, the EU and US response to Israeli genocide has been straight from the abuser's handbook, Darvo. Deny, attack, reverse victim and offender, and if that doesn't work, sure, just change the subject. So as the genocide in Gaza continues, you want to talk about everything but Gaza. You refuse to put the item on an agenda stacked with every cliche imaginable, from Venezuela to Iran, with pride of place given to the old reliable Russian interference. So across the pond, Special Agent Nancy Pelosi gives the signal, branding Palestine protesters as Kremlin operatives, and like clockwork, the dark insinuations begin in Europe. Everyone can see what you're doing. It's tedious, it's predictable. You've been doing it since 2016, and it isn't going to work anymore. The mass movement is focused like a laser on genocide. Everyone knows it's happening, and Europe is...
I'm sorry, this is a debate with a title, and so you should stick to the issue. Thank you.
Always a good sign when they have to cut off your mic. Let's see what she is, and let's listen to it. Let's watch another clip.
President, I voted against this motion after a week of horror in Gaza and the EU diving in head first, draping our parliament in the Israeli flag, aiding and abetting in war crimes, including the bombing of a hospital, and still we find it impossible to say that Palestinian lives matter. We're still privileging one category of victims over another. We talk about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, but why is there a humanitarian crisis? Is it a national disaster? Who cut off the water, fuel and electricity? Are we not sure? Who is bombing Palestinian civilians? Do we not know? Do you think we could mention it? There is a crime unfolding in Gaza now, such as we have not seen since the 1940s, and we are in it up to our necks. We're watching Israel murder Palestinian civilians and preparing to drive millions of them into the Sinai Desert to annex and colonize their land. It's another Nakba. It's a crime against humanity, not a humanitarian crisis. The EU will never live down this shame. Long live Palestine, long live Gaza.
Great speaker. We have a couple more clips.
I've been involved in politics for 40 years, but I have never seen anything like what is being unleashed in Gaza, in full public view, while the world watches it unfold. 10 days of relentless airstrikes, 1 in 1,000 people murdered by the Israeli government in a week, open declarations of siege, 24 hours of fuel, electricity and water left, collective punishment on innocent people, all illegal, all war crimes. And when the EU should have been arguing for a ceasefire, for the upholding of international law, for the protection of civilians, Ursula von der Leyen touches down in Tel Aviv to photo op the preparation of a genocide and says Europe stands with Israel now and in the days to come. How dare she? She has no authority in foreign affairs matter. She does not speak for me. She does not speak for Ireland, and she does not speak for the citizens of Europe. We stand for peace. We stand for justice for the people of Palestine and for the upholding of international law. It's long past the time that this woman exited the stage. It's time for her to go and for the International Criminal Court to investigate her.
So the debate is closed.
And one more.
Listening to the cheerleading in here, safe and secure, thousands of miles away from the front lines, I think it would be a useful exercise for us to remind ourselves about what ordinary Ukrainians are experiencing. The Economist reports of forced recruitment across the country. Draftees with no experience or training are being sent to the front in what a UK minister calls First World War levels of attrition. Casualty figures are secret, but we know they're estimates of about 120,000. Battalion commanders tell the Washington Post of recruits fleeing positions en masse. Politico reports a crackdown on deserters. These are human beings, and there is a shameful lack of empathy for ordinary people in the war rhetoric in here. The debate is about keeping the weapons flowing to keep the war going. Ukraine is burning through a generation of men, sons, husbands, brothers who can never be replaced. This cannot go on indefinitely. And ye sickening war generals who sit in here and will these men to our deaths, you make me sick. We need peace, we need dialogue, however unpleasant that may be.
And that was Claire Daly, who lost her seat in the European Parliament, who was smeared and attacked by the political establishment and by the media. But the great thing is, I know that whatever she does next, she's going to kick ass. As you can tell, she's an incredibly inspiring person, politician, organizer. And if you want, you can watch our interview with her. We have another announcement, which is that most of you guys watching, I'm sure, know about this. But Brianna Joy Gray was fired at the Hill, and Amy Goodman reported on this. So let's show a clip of Amy Goodman because it's really important to show this story, but there's also a bonus treat at the end.
Media news. The Washington-based news outlet, The Hill, has fired Brianna Joy Gray, the co-host of Rising, The Hill's daily morning show. Gray's been a vocal critic of Israel's war on Gaza. Last year, The Hill also fired the political commentator Katie Halper after she called Israel an apartheid state.
So, guys, terrible that Bree got fired. Although, like Claire, who lost her seat, I'm not worried about Bree. Everyone should support her Patreon and her show at patreon.com/badface. But yeah, sometimes when you are on the right side of history, you get punished for it. But luckily, I'm sure Claire and Bree are going to be doing great things. Bree already has a show, so we know what she's doing next. And I'm excited for her to have more energy on to spend on her show, not to have to be dividing her time between Rising and her show. And what else? Anything else, Brad, that I need to mention? No, I guess that's it. But I am thankful to Amy Goodman for featuring Bodhi. She just took my Twitter photo, which happens to have Bodhi in it. Really quickly going to read the super chats and then we will wrap. Okay, let's see what we got. Wadeworth, thank you so much for that generous chat. Yassim Miller, thank you for joining. Ed Lidawi, it's quite simple. Every Israeli claim is exactly the opposite. All their allegations are actually confessions and projection. Yes. Al Cook gave me a nice super chat. Super sticker from Alex. Thank you so much. Thank you for this great report. Thank you. Thanks, Katie, for all that you do. From Verena Frazier. Why do many realists think we should treat China, Taiwan more aggressively than Russia, Ukraine? Both China and Russia are nuclear armed, have aging populations, and want to influence the region. I will ask Professor Mearsheimer the next time he's on. The Rev, hi Rev, I haven't seen you in a while. Professor Mearsheimer and his work is a wonderful gift. Southern Taiwan, Gamzia, gratitude. Viva Katie. Put a picture of Mearsheimer smiling on a shirt with the caption, "The lobby is working overtime," and I'll buy it instantly. That's actually a good idea. Didn't Biden handle Ukraine policy under the Obama administration? Am I hallucinating that? Nukes are illegal under international law as well as immoral. We could turn to It's a Mistake by Men at Work for evidence. Say it isn't so, Katie. Say it isn't so. I don't understand. Someone explain that to me. Who's the little guy with the wet nose with sweat glands Katie Halper was holding in the picture? Oh, Bodie. Is that what you mean? She's a girl, though. Oh, and then Brad, can we just show the picture of Mearsheimer dressed up on his website? Do you know what I'm talking about? If not, I can do it. Okay, let me do it. Hold on. I just want to show people Mearsheimer's website because it's pretty cool. All right. And there he is, dressed up as the prince, as Machiavelli. John J. Mearsheimer. And look, they even have a quiz. What do Al Capone, Michael Jordan, Milton Friedman, and John Mearsheimer all have in common? They were all born in Brooklyn and made their reputation in Chicago. It's a cool website. Anyway. Well, guys, thank you so much for watching. We'll be back next week. And please, because we were blessed with so much time with Professor Mearsheimer, some of this will be Patreon only. So to see the full stream with Professor Mearsheimer, please become Patreon supporters at patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show. Again, that's patreon.com/The Katie Halper Show, so you can hear his thoughts on Russia, Ukraine, and World War. Bye, everyone. Thanks, Brad.
Okay, calm down. You got limits, man. You got limits, man. Okay,